So, as we try to make some sense of how one recognizes truth, maybe it'll help us in arguing well. And arguing, by the way, is not quarreling. So formulating through terms, making some sort of, taking truth statements and putting them into a valid argument form. Let's do one slide that addresses more of the aspects of Christianity, than the second slide will just deal about how we know something. Regardless of your faith expression, or even if one's an atheist, this should be clear and relevant. All right? So let's start out by saying what a revealed religion means. Christianity is one of the revealed religions. It's one of the three great monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So Christianity is a revealed religion. That is, it can be understood through reason, but not totally be grasped by reason alone. Okay? So it can be understood by reason, but not totally grasped by reason alone. Now, the reason why it can't be totally grasped is because aspects of our faith are mysteries. The Orthodox literally refer to the sacraments as mysteries. We call them sacraments, but it means the same thing. And if you remember back to the first quarter, a mystery is something that can't be totally known through reason alone. Okay, but it still can be known. It's just not entirely comprehensible. So the Trinity, the human person, these are all aspects of mystery. Yeah, Tristan, I never knew how you could see over there.
I'm just going to stay here.
You have to have like eyes like a bird. Now, some of these things can only be known by revelation. You would never, ever come to them as a conclusion through reason alone. The Trinity is one of those. You know, when you state just what the Trinity is, that you have three persons distinct from each other, yet only one God, that's really beyond reason. You would never come to that through reason alone. The incarnation. How is it that you have a God who became man, took on all the weaknesses of man, yet never lost his absolute power? So he retained his human nature, and it wasn't obliterated by his divine nature. That his human will was never superseded by his divine will. You're not going to come up with that by reason alone, although through reason we can explain it. All right? Now, because of those things doesn't mean that they're not reasonable. That's the premise of Christianity. Okay? We've argued over these things. There's been councils that have debated on the nature of Christ, on the Trinity and the Holy Spirit, monothelitism, monophysitism, one will and one spirit. This stuff went on through the 7th century. So it wasn't as if, though, Christianity didn't grapple with how to articulate it. In other words, they understood that Jesus was God. They understood that God was God and the Holy Spirit was God. But they used these councils to try to articulate it. We've argued over these things, but they're non-negotiables for a Christian. All right? If a person says, I'm a Christian, but I don't believe in the Trinity, nor do I accept it, you cease to be a Christian. That statement excludes you from the Christian belief. If you say, I'm a Christian, but I don't really accept that God was incarnate, you're no longer a Christian. I mean, you could say you are, but you've excluded yourself. You know? If you say, I'm a Christian, but I don't believe God is all good, I believe there's a dualism there, that's not Christianity. All right? That's another religion, Taoism or such. So anyway, we've argued over them, but they're really non-negotiables as far as Christianity is concerned. So these, among other things, are known as the eternal things. They don't change, and it's not limited to that. In fact, I'll explain how there's a lot that falls underneath that. The eternal things, they can be known. Now, if you remember, we knew these eternal things mostly through signs, didn't we? So the sacraments came to us in bread and wine and oil and water, because as tangible people, we needed some access to what was eternal and invisible. Okay? So eternal things can be known. They do not change. That's the nature of an eternal thing. It does not change. It remains as it is and always was. So the Trinity, as we know it, always is and always was, even if we learn to articulate it a little better. Okay? Christ being present in the Eucharist and such. Now I know you can't read it. It's behind that error message, so I'll read it to you. It simply says, temporal things are bound by their nature to change. Temporal things are bound by their nature to change. That should be obvious. We see the word temporary and temporal. So things that are temporary are going to change. We've got to distinguish between what is temporal and what is eternal, and how that relates to ethics. Okay? So the statement will be, and our claim will be, that ethics or morality is in the realm of the eternal things. Now, we've already discussed this, but you may have forgotten some of this. If morality was based on conscience, well, we all have varying degrees of it. Some have seared theirs shut. If morality was based on human nature, well, wasn't that what morality was supposed to control? Plus, isn't human nature tend to be selfish? If morality was based on evolution, isn't evolution by nature something that changes? All right? So this is why we say it's based on something outside of this. It has to come from the outside, even if it governs us from the inside. So we say then that natural law represents participation in eternal things. You should already be hearing, what's that the definition of natural law? Natural law was man's participation in eternal law. Eternal law was the law that exists in God's own mind. So even though this isn't something direct for us, through the natural inclinations, the inclination for truth, the inclination to self-preserve, the inclination to procreate, and so on, through these things, these elements of us, we can participate in something eternal, and they could be known. All right? This is why we say Christian and Catholic morality particularly is based in natural law, informed by divine revelation. All right? That's our statement. This is kind of like the one slide on the theology of this. Any questions on that? All right. So for some of you deep thinkers, I think you will prefer this slide. When you say that something can be known objectively, already you're in controversial waters. Not everybody believes that. So I'm going to give you a definition for beauty, I'm going to give you a definition for truth, and I'm going to give you a definition for goodness. Now, you don't need to write this down. This is just a little FYI. These are the three great ideas by which all things are known. It is what they call an epistemological ladder. Through beauty, you discover truth. Through truth, you discover goodness. There was a comic strip that went around Facebook, and it was this like long, almost like a seesaw, with like 4 or 5 people on one end of it, and one person on the other end, and then somebody below it. And here's what it said. On the one side where there were all these people was a sociologist. And it said above them, sociology is really applied psychology. And there was a psychologist. And above them, well, psychology is really applied biology. Above the biologist, it said, well, biology is really applied chemistry. And chemists said, well, chemistry is really applied physics. And physics said, well, physics is really applied math. And the math guy was on the other side going, I can hardly see you people over there. But underneath was an epistemological philosopher that said, it's all based on this. Why? Because epistemology is the branch of philosophy that says how you know anything. So until you know how you know, which is odd, right? We don't teach people how to know what they should know. You know, we give them reasoned arguments, but you don't, like, my daughters, when they were young, you know, in my library, found a book that said how to read a book. They thought that was the most hilarious thing they've ever seen. And I said, why do you think it's so obvious that you know how to read a book? Because you can say what the words say. Maybe there are strategies that you never understood. It's the same way with knowing. Just because you write something down and you put it on the test, now I know it. How do you know it? So that's what we're going to talk about here, okay? But in very, very simple terms. So let me give you a definition for beauty. Beauty is the splendor of a thing. That's pretty cool. Beauty is a splendor of a thing. That comes from Aristotle, by the way. Think of this. When we get into doing love and intimacy, because it looks like that's one of the topics you guys want to pick, I'm going to show you what it's like to fall in love with somebody. What it's like to recognize the splendor within them. That it's a splendor of the being. And that's what you're attracted to, that it goes beyond things that you can see. That's kind of neat. All right? Beauty leads us to goodness. Goodness is how we conform to the truth in God's mind. Okay? Goodness is how we conform to the truth in God's mind. I'm sorry, truth. Did I say goodness? Truth is how we conform to what's in God's mind. Let's leave it at that. I don't want to screw up the terms. Truth is how we conform to what's in God's mind. So if it's true in the eternal God, as well as we understand it, that's the element that we have that truth. So beauty leads to that truth. And then finally, truth leads us to goodness. Goodness is the perfection of a thing. Goodness is the perfection of a thing, but you need to know ultimately it's God. All right? And let me tell you how you already know this. You may have never articulated it like this, but you already know this. Okay? If, let's say, Casey's mom asked her to cut up some onions for, dinner. And she grabs the cutting board and the knife, and she's using it, and she just happens to comment, "This is a really good knife." Now, why would you make a statement like that? You're talking about the perfection of it. It does so well. Sometimes they even call it the virtue of a thing. And, like Anthony, if your dad told you to go out and dig in the garden, there's 3 shovels there, and you looked at them, you might say, which one's the good one? And why would you say that? Which one is going to be closest to the perfection of what a shovel would be? So we already use terms like this, right? So all we got to figure out is how do we get from beauty to truth to goodness when we're trying to talk about these things we're talking about in this class. A little bit of an aside because I'm an artist, right? I've been an artist my entire adult life. Let me tell you that the modern world has destroyed the understanding of beauty when it comes particularly to music and art. I mean, it's really something. They haven't done it in other disciplines, but they've done it in art and also in music. Some music is so vulgar, and I don't know how you can possibly consider it to be beautiful. Some art is so horrific, right? So I remember studying art when I was in college in the early 80s. You put a plastic crucifix in a pail of urine, and you give it a name, and you expect that to lead to anything up here, right? I mean, so here's another way that we even know that. Does anybody here like watching girls gymnastics in the Olympics or figure skating? It's something, man. They're like little springs bouncing around. It's and it's so symmetrical and fluid, right? Could you imagine if instead of one of those beautiful routines, a young guy came out to do a mat routine, rolled around 2 or 3 times in the mat, stood up to the jumping jack and held his hands in the air, and said, "Well, that's my interpretation." Do you think he'd get a perfect 10? Not in a million years. Why? Because that somehow sports has still retained an objective standard, right? And so has that athletics. So we know that, all right? So anyway, let's just leave it at that. Anyway, beauty leads to truth. Truth leads to goodness. I'm not sure if there's anything there that was necessary. Well, just so we know that we're talking about God himself with goodness, we'll leave it at that. Okay, now, to say something is good, I'm just trying to make a few points here. When we say something is good, we mean to say that it's good always and everywhere. Once we've determined that it is good always and everywhere, and for everyone, right? And you know this too. If I were to say to you, as long as you are able to and you have the opportunity, if a person next to you is dying of hunger, isn't it good you feed them? Yes. Is that just true for you? Or is it true for everyone and everywhere? You would say, no, it's true for everyone and everywhere. Because that makes sense for us. If I were to say to you, say the opposite, right? Racism is evil. Is that just for you? Or is racism evil for everyone and everywhere? We would say, no, it's evil for everyone and everywhere. All right? So we already, if you accept even those 2 basic ones, you've already accepted objective truth. Now you might be thinking, well, that's the easy stuff. What about love? Is love between a man and a woman in marriage, is that the only expression that should manifest itself sexually? Maybe you don't accept that, right? You might say, well, no, but that one now I don't accept. Okay, we'll get to that later. What I'm going to try to do when we get to there is I'll show you if you accept one, you must accept the other. And if you don't like the other, you're going to be in a state of contradiction. We'll get to that in a second. I don't want to get ahead. Not today. Okay, so let's just pretend that we've agreed there are some things we know are good, and there are some things we know are bad. That's fine. But how do we know which is which? How on earth are we going to come up with that? Okay? It's a lot easier to say that we can know it. Or, I'm sorry, it's a lot easier to say that it is always good. But how do we know exactly what with the harder cases? With marriage. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to have to just ask ourselves before we start, and this is what you have to keep in mind throughout dialectic. When we're in the realm of so-called proof, and I use that term loosely, more or less we're asking what convinces us. Let's be careful what we consider evidence, or let's be careful what we consider acceptable evidence. For instance, if we're doing empirical testing, then we could use empirical science to test it, and that will be evidence, and that's very good evidence. If you manage to fall in love with somebody and enjoy life in marriage like I do, I can't give you proof for my wife's love. Maybe you could say, but there's demonstrations of it. Yes, but that's not proof. As a matter of fact, my guess is that for the lucky handful of you, you're going to come to the conclusion in 20 to 30 years that love is a way of knowing. And you're not going to be able to explain and articulate it or demonstrate it empirically. And it's going to be a beautiful thing. How do I know he or she loves me? I know it. How do you know? I know it. Prove it to me. There's no proof for that. By the way, love is a way of knowing, and so is revelation. So if anybody thinks that simply revelation is blind allegiance, you've missed it. Okay? Revelation is a way of knowing. Love is a way of knowing. You are not going to use empirical testing that is only used on material things with immaterial realities. So if a friend which came to me once and said, prove to me God exists. Well, what do you mean prove to you God exists? Prove to me he exists. At the time George Bush was president. Like George Bush exists. Well, you can't. Well, see, then you don't know that he exists. You're almost dealing with an individual who doesn't grasp the difference between empirical proof and evidence. Okay? So that brings us then to what I want to address here before we start dialectic. Mere opinion. You know that everybody has an opinion. That's a stated line. What's so good about an opinion? Everybody has one. And an opinion's a good thing. It's nothing bad about an opinion. If you're attracted to a young guy or a young girl, and maybe one of your friends doesn't quite see it, that's all right. In your opinion, they're beautiful, and that's good. Maybe you like vanilla ice cream better than strawberry. You don't have to prove that. That's okay. All right? Those are very good things to have opinions on. The problem is that if there was a court case going on and they were trying to determine whether or not the defendant was competent, guess what? They're not going to call me or Jonathan. Not because we're not smart people. What do we know about the individual? They don't want our mere opinions. Looks smart to me. Looks like he can do it. They're not after that, right? What they are after and what we're going to be after, and we're using this lightly, right? I'm not trying to overstress this because this has some elements from the Enlightenment. We're looking for a justified true belief. And the way that we, in this class, are going to get there is we are going to support our points through reasoned argument. But you have to know what an argument is, right? We're going to develop terms, which is going to result in some sort of definition. We're going to put them into truth statements. This is that is this, and then we're going to form an argument. And an argument is not true or false. An argument is valid or invalid. Statements are true and false. And we're going to make the case. And we can't prove it empirically. So if you bring that level of, scrutiny to this, you're not able to. All right? We can't weigh these things out on a scale. Now, has anybody heard of the principle of non-contradiction? It sounds a little odd, but it's quite simple, and you'll get it. Here's what the principle of non-contradiction is. This comes from Aristotle, by the way. Okay? So this isn't even a Christian tenet. A thing cannot be and not be. The principle of non-contradiction states, at least one version of it, a thing cannot be and not be the same way at the same time. It's quite simple. You'll get it. A thing cannot be and not be in the same way at the same time. So this writing up here, I can't say this is blue and this is not blue. The principle of contradiction doesn't allow that. It's an either or. Not that everything falls into some sort of, binary like that. But what happens is, I can't say I am male and not male. Now, I know this is obvious, but I'm telling you, it's not going to be obvious once we start forming the arguments. Because we're going to find, you will find yourselves in some state of contradiction. Again, I know you can't read that, but what that says is, when confronted with a contradiction to one's mere opinion, when confronted with a contradiction to one's mere opinion, when confronted to a contradiction with one's mere opinion, there are various paths you can take. That's probably the easiest way to say it. There are various paths you can take. And to wrap up this slide and this presentation, I have just 4 of them. And I'll read the top ones to you because it's a little unclear there. One is, when you're confronted with, in other words, let's just talk about homosexual marriage. Perhaps you're all in. And what I'm going to do is going to present information that's going to challenge that. So what I'm trying to say is, what would be your response? The first one, and it is not just 4, I'm just giving you 4. It could be apathy. That leads to ignorance. It's a little green arrow and leads to ignorance. You've been in discussions with people where they just don't care. I couldn't care less about this point. Maybe you would talk about the death penalty, right? And you're trying to say the death penalty is a bad thing, and they're all for it. And you want to say, well, did you know that now that we have genetic testing, we realize that people on death row are innocent, absolutely innocent, yet people are being put to death? Maybe that person never knew that. And all of a sudden they're thinking, I don't care. You talk to people like that. You can't reach them. It's a pitiable state, right? That's not going to help in dialectic, obviously. The second one is dismissive. And that leads to dullness of mind. So dismissive leads to dullness of mind. Now, maybe they don't understand what you just said. Did you hear what I just say? There's people that are being put to death, and they might be innocent. We just don't know the genetics. How do you know that? They're just going to, they're not even going to listen to what you're saying. All right? It could be that they don't have the wherewithal to grasp the argument, or the argument's nuanced. Or you might say, as I'm going to say with homosexual marriage, and I'm not trying to sound, how do I want to say, I'm not trying to sound extreme, but I will give you a heads up. I'll make the case that if you accept 2 men being married, not only will you have to accept 3 people being married, you'll have to accept sexual love between a father and a daughter. And I'm going to make the case that you'll have no options. You'll either accept man and woman or any of that. Right? So we'll leave that for another time. Now, some people might just say, I don't even get the connection between the whole thing. Well, it's a dull mind. All right? And there's not enough humility or wisdom there to realize, I don't quite grasp the argument. So you just dismiss it. That's also a pitiable state. All right? The bottom here is deliberation. Deliberation can also often lead to suspended judgment. Let me tell you what I mean by that. And again, we're talking in terms of if we are presented. This goes with anything. I don't care if you're trying to figure out, the best way to get to the mall. If somebody is giving you information, all of a sudden you think they might be right, how do you react? Are you going to ignore them? Are you going to blow them off? Are you going to deliberate on what they said? So when I was your age, I am telling you how arrogant I was. I thought I knew better than most teachers and most people in the church. And I was going to leave the Catholic Church. That was my goal. There were just certain things I could not accept. For whatever grace, and it was probably my mother's prayers, I decided I was going to wait a couple of years. And why? Because I didn't want to be, it was a proud thing. I didn't want to be a fool. I don't want to be a fool to leave something when somebody said, why did you leave? And I couldn't really articulate it. All I could say was things like, well, it's stupid, they're mean, they're oppressed. Nothing that convinced myself. So for 2 years, I studied. And I started to find that I was in error more than they were. And I also realized that something that's been around 2,000 years wasn't going to fall into the purview of a 17-year-old's brain who really never thought beyond his own existence for most of his life. So just a little humility brought me at least to that point. It wasn't much. So what happens here? All you're doing is saying, look, because things can't contradict each other and both be and not be the same way at the same time, and what I'm hearing now, I don't know that I buy into it, but I also can't just intellectually dismiss it. I can't do it. I have to be honest with myself. So when I was a teenager, it got to the point where somebody would say, I thought you were leaving the church. I'm thinking about it. Okay, it sounds wishy-washy, but if you're deliberating something, you're deliberating it. And this isn't a half-bet position to be in. I think it's quite a wise position to be in. Now, here's what you do need to know about this. This is temporary. This isn't where you live. All right? If you're in this position over something that's eternal for 10, 15 years, I hope you've been taking care of a paraplegic 24/7. Because I don't know what else has been so important in your life that's been taking you away from beauty, truth, and goodness. Okay? And I don't mean to say that, in a glib way. I just mean that unless you're in extreme forms of charity, why are you in this for that length of time? Again, that would be pitiable. And I think if you were here too long, you were never really there, or you didn't stay there, you wound right back up in apathy or dismissive. I think at some point you venture back up. Now you have to bear with me if this isn't so good. I literally did this morning during activity period and my prep first period. I just thought about it this morning. Now, here's the goal of education. If you say, well, you know what, I accept the argument. I don't know, I don't really like it. I'd rather hold my previous belief, but I have to be honest, that's not a half-bet argument. I didn't realize that people were being put to death that were vindicated by, DNA. And if we don't really know, then maybe we shouldn't be putting people to death. I was for the death penalty, but you know what, that makes a good point. If you get to that point, you've reached a stage of enlightenment, which is what education's about. Education is supposed to do what? Remember, it's supposed to bring us from ignorance to knowledge, from dullness of mind to understanding, from foolishness to wisdom. Okay, now one last thing. Let's go back to mere opinion. If we're in dialectic and somebody's only here, how do we deal with that? We have a very difficult time. So you might be thinking, and I want you to know this, right? You might be thinking, but it's necessary to have an open mind. And I'm all for that. But I don't know if many people know what that means. G.K. Chesterton said, an open mind is like an open mouth. It's meant to be open until there's something solid to chew down on. So you can have an open mind, but not about eternal things. And you know this. I know you agree with me. Because if I told you, I think we should reconsider slavery, I want you to have an open mind. Hey, in a million years, you're going to have an open mind on that. If I told you, I think we should be allowed to kill innocent people randomly, if it's for the good of everybody else, you're not going to have an open mind on that. So you already accepted that an open mind is not a good thing for all things. You wouldn't have an open mouth and let anybody throw anything in. We need to do the same thing. So what is the opposite of an open mind? It's not a closed mind. It's a judgment. Once an open mind has made a judgment on eternal things, you've now accepted it. All right? Questions? How did I do that?